Fauci, I don't expect you today to admit that you approved of NIH funding for gain-of-function research in Wuhan, but your repeated denials have worn thin, and a majority of Americans, frankly, don't believe you. Even the NIH now admits that EcoHealth Alliance did perform experiments in Wuhan that created viruses not found in nature that actually did gain in lethality.
COVID-19 pandemic, which emerged in late 2019, changed the world in ways that no one could have predicted. It wasn't just a health crisis. It was a global catastrophe that upended economies, disrupted societies, and exposed the deep flaws in how we handle public health and governance. As the world shut down in response to the pandemic, we saw contradictions, confusion, and selective leadership decisions that made everything worse. The world's reaction to COVID-19 wasn't just about a virus. It was about power, control, and broken systems. When COVID-19 arrived, entire nations came to a screeching halt. Borders were closed, airports closed, and businesses shuttered. The global economy, already fragile in many places, teetered on the brink of collapse. The stock market plunged, millions of jobs vanished overnight, and small businesses, especially those that didn't rely on e-commerce, were left to die. What was particularly striking about these shutdowns was the inconsistency in how they were enforced. In many regions, liberal governors were quick to impose strict lockdown measures, but these measures often seemed selectively enforced, favoring larger tax revenue-generating industries. Small businesses, mom-and-pop shops, local restaurants, gyms, and churches were forced to close their doors. Meanwhile, big-box retailers, liquor stores, and even gentlemen's clubs remained open, their operations deemed essential despite clear health risks. Why? Because their taxes were essential to state budgets, and perhaps because their business models, like so many others, had the ability to keep generating revenue regardless of the restrictions. Who was responsible? Who is Dr. Anthony Fauci? Why was he at the epicenter of the COVID pandemic? What role did he play in the creation of the disease? How and why was he involved in the cover-up? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Anthony Stephen Fauci was born on December 24, 1940 in Brooklyn, New York, the second child of first-generation Italian-American parents, Eugenia and Stephen. He worked the cash register or made deliveries for his father's pharmacy to make extra money. Fauci attended Regis High School in Manhattan and was captain of the basketball team. He then studied as a pre-medical student at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. After graduating first in his class from the New York City's Cornell Medical College in 1966, he completed his internship and residency at New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center. Fauci began his extensive career at the National Institute of Health's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease in 1968 and briefly worked as chief resident at the New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center from 1970 to 71. He was a senior investigator in the Laboratory of Clinical Investigation, starting groundbreaking research in immunoregulation, and developed successful drug regimens for polyarteritis nodosa, granulomatosis, and polyangiitis, and lymphomatoid granulomatosis. Fauci helped George W. Bush develop the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, focused on combating the disease in Africa and other parts of the developing world upon its launch in 2003. He gained a reputation for handling the West Nile virus under President Bill Clinton, the anthrax scare and SARS under Bush, and the swine flu epidemic under Barack Obama. However, Fauci was also supposedly investing in these drug companies, which is legal but may have had later unintended consequences. But Fauci's history goes way back in a very controversial way. In May 1983, during the AIDS crisis, a theory about the new disease was published by Fauci in the Journal of the American Medical Association. A UPI report on May 5, 1983 cited Fauci, "Household contacts can transmit AIDS." The Associated Press asked the next day, does AIDS spread by routine contact? And quoted Fauci as their lead authority. The New York Times also asked about transmission between family members, citing Fauci's article as the source. Fauci was then appointed director of the NIAID in 1984 and played a key role in HIV/AIDS research, for which he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2008. Fauci led the National Institutes of Health-funded research testing AIDS drugs on hundreds of foster children for 2 decades, often without providing them a basic protection afforded in federal law and required by some states, meaning they were not of the age of consent. In the 1990s, foster care agencies sought treatment for their HIV-infected children, not yet available in the marketplace. The foster children ranged from infants to late teens, according to interviews and government records, and exposed the children to medical research and drugs that were known to have serious side effects in adults and for which the safety in children was unknown. In one study, researchers reported a disturbing higher death rate among children who took higher doses of a drug. That study was unable to determine a safe and effective dosage. Press accounts mentioned Fauci's article immediately sounded the alarm. Reminiscent of Dr. Joseph Mengele, Fauci had unfettered reign experimenting on children with AIDS who were in the foster care system. Many would argue that Fauci's methods, then and recently, as well as the Biden administration, violated the Nuremberg codes established after World War II. In one study, researchers reported a disturbing higher death rate among children who took higher doses of a drug. That study was unable to determine a safe and effective dosage as well. In 1983, the government established special protections for children in foster care or orphanages and required researchers and oversight boards to appoint independent advocates for any child being treated that involved greater than minimal risk and lacked the promise of direct benefit. Some foster agencies required the protection regardless of risks and benefits. Researchers and foster agencies told AP that foster children in AIDS drug trials often weren't given such advocates, even though research institutions many times promised to do so to gain access to the children, and Fauci knew it. Illinois officials believe none of their nearly 200 foster children in AIDS studies got independent monitors, even though researchers signed a document guaranteeing the appointment of an advocate for each individual ward participating in their respective medical research. Fauci did not care. New York City could find records showing 142, less than a third of the 465 foster children in AIDS drug trials, got such monitors, even though city policy required them. The city has asked an outside firm to investigate. Some states declined to participate in medical experiments. Tennessee said its foster care rules prohibit enlisting children in such trials. California requires a judge's order. Sometimes foster parents or biological parents were consulted, other times not. Wisconsin never allowed clinical experiments with children in the foster care system. Officials estimated that 5% to 10% of the 13,878 children enrolled in pediatric AIDS studies funded by NIH since the late 1980s were in foster care. Some children were taken off the drug dapsone because of serious toxicity. Others developed rashes, and the rates of death and blood toxicity were significantly higher in children who took the medicine daily rather than weekly. At least 10 children died from a variety of causes, including 4 from blood poisoning, and researchers said they were unable to determine a safe, useful dosage. They said the deaths didn't appear to be directly attributable to dapsone, but nonetheless were disturbing. We now know, of course, that Fauci's theory on transmission was wrong. HIV, the virus that was later discovered to cause AIDS, is only transmitted by exposure to infected body fluids, such as blood or by sexual contact. The infant infection involved direct transmission from the mother to child during pregnancy. Fauci then totally changed his position, and he told the Baltimore Sun, "It is absolutely preposterous to suggest that AIDS can be contracted through normal social contact, like being in the same room with someone or sitting on a bus with them. The poor gays have received a very raw deal on this." Less than 2 months after his JAMA article appeared, Fauci publicly contradicted himself without ever acknowledging his own vital role in promoting the false claim to begin with. This would not be the last time Fauci would change his position to be politically expedient. But it would be the COVID crisis that would bring Fauci into the public eye for many reasons. As the disease began spreading, Fauci's commentary on COVID-19 given to CNN on January 24, 2020, took place the day after the Wuhan region of China went into draconian lockdown. Asked about the Chinese government's decision, Fauci declared, "That's something that I don't think we could possibly do in the United States. I can't imagine shutting down New York or Los Angeles." Well, that opinion would change. Fauci, for reasons yet unknown, rejected Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's assertion that the virus originated in a Chinese lab. Then social media began shutting down anyone, including leading researchers and medical experts, who also agreed that the lab leak was the source. Despite Fauci's initial statement that shutdowns were not required, he again changed his mind. He said, "Historically, when you shut things down, it doesn't have a major effect," which was Fauci's position during the 2014 Ebola outbreak. A recently resurfaced interview on NBC shows Fauci warning against draconian quarantine measures for Ebola and chastising several state governors for enacting hasty emergency restrictions to contain an outbreak in the United States without considering the unintended consequences. But then Fauci decided shutdowns were a great idea, a decision accepted, which destroyed the U.S. economy as well as education. But then President Trump launched Operation Warp Speed to have the research labs develop a vaccine for COVID. Fauci, already in deep with the big pharma companies, led the charge, although there were no double-blind or placebo studies as required by the Food and Drug Administration, the first time in history. When Trump cited other sources in the medical community who stated the proven anti-malaria drug hydroxychloroquine and the drug ivermectin were adequate treatments, Fauci disagreed. These cheap, effective drugs, later proven to be highly effective, were denied to the American public at large. Later, it was learned that those involved in pushing the free Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer vaccines were getting massive kickbacks. That would explain why they did not want hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin used. When the Trump administration declared that the country could reopen by Easter, Fauci convinced him to scrap that timeline. COVID-19 vaccines were responsible for a variety of side effects, including pain, redness, or swelling at the injection site, tiredness, headache, muscle pain, chills, fever, pericarditis, thrombosis, myocarditis, arrhythmias, hypertension, acute coronary syndrome, cardiac arrest, and anemia and nausea. Circulatory problems, blood clots, respiratory failure, organ damage, and death were also a result. Big Pharma has immunity from liability due to injury or death from these unproven drugs, but these were to be taken by consenting adults, at least until the Biden administration. The government requirement for immunization was passed on as a strong suggestion to private industry. Tens of millions of people who were wary of the drugs took these initial shots for fear of losing their jobs. Even the military was affected, and many personnel were discharged if they refused. In 2014, EcoHealth received a 5-year, $3.7 million grant from the NIAID to collect and analyze bat coronaviruses in China. At a minimum, EcoHealth's experiments should have been forwarded to the HHS for review. They did not. We now know this is not true. NIAID told EcoHealth to stop its experiments because they violated the then-existent pause on gain-of-function research. The novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, has since caused approximately 170 million cases and 3.5 million deaths. Fauci said that no gain-of-function was being performed, but when evidence proved otherwise, and it surfaced, he said that we can't expect to really know all of what's going on at a lab receiving U.S. taxpayer funding. Now remember, previously, Fauci had denied that any taxpayer money had gone to fund anything along these lines in China at the Wuhan clinic. Lawrence A. Tabak, NIH Principal Deputy Director, noted in a letter to Congress that the terms of the grant award required EcoHealth to immediately report a 1 log increase in growth, a 10-fold increase, and it failed to do so. The specific language dated in 2016 was, should any of the MERS-like or SARS-like chimeras generated under this grant show evidence of enhanced virus growth greater than 1 log over the parental backbone strain, you must stop all experiments. Tabak confessed at a House subcommittee hearing that the U.S. government had indeed funded dangerous research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which modified bat coronaviruses shortly before the outbreak began in late 2019. In April 2021, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control paused the Johnson & Johnson vaccine out of an abundance of caution after a small number of people who received the J&J vaccine developed thrombosis and thrombocytopenia syndrome, a blood clotting disorder. I, your humble narrator, had 2 friends who died after getting the second and third shot respectively of these symptoms. Additionally, the FDA updated the fact sheet for the J&J COVID-19 vaccine and added Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare disorder that occurs when a person's immune system damages nerve cells and causes muscle weakness or paralysis, as a risk of the vaccine. On June 1, 2023, the FDA revoked the J&J vaccine's emergency use authorization. Total sales of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine surpassed $80 billion, and more than 400 million doses of the shot and subsequent boosters have been administered in the U.S. alone. Under oath, Fauci said that taxpayers and the government agencies such as National Institutes of Health and NIAID has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Rand Paul held Fauci culpable for research done in the Wuhan, China lab, which Paul believes triggered the viral outbreak. Fauci actually reaffirmed the shocking suspicion in his testimony that the 6 feet apart social distancing recommendation that he promoted was arbitrary, not based on science, and sort of just appeared. Conclusively, the Select Subcommittee held Dr. Fauci publicly accountable for pandemic-era failures, and Fauci changed his story under oath in both House and Senate hearings and lied under oath several times when questioned by Republican Senators Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, but he was protected by the Biden administration's Department of Justice and Attorney General Merrick Garland. This was further proven when treasure troves of documents and emails uncovered by congressional investigators and investigative journalists established that the NIAID was in fact funding gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses at the Wuhan lab via a grant to the scandal-plagued nonprofit EcoHealth Alliance, which the Biden administration had just debarred from receiving federal funding. Part of the evidence was when Anthony Fauci sent an email to prominent virologist Dr. Jeremy Farrar in February 2020 and discussed a phone call that Fauci had with virologist Dr. Christian Anderson discussing concerns about a lab leak. This contradicts Fauci previously stating the lab leak was impossible. Dr. Fauci showed no remorse for the millions of lives affected by his divisive rhetoric and his unscientific policies. He never apologized to the thousands of Americans who lost their jobs if they refused the vaccine, nor did he apologize to children experiencing severe learning loss because of actions he promoted. When confronted with the evidence against him, Fauci confirmed that his senior advisor, Dr. David Morens, had in fact violated official NIH policies and potentially broke federal law. Dr. Morens deliberately obstructed the Select Subcommittee's investigation into the origins of COVID-19, meaning the lab leak, and unlawfully deleted federal COVID-19 records, and shared non-public information about National Institutes of Health grant processes with his best friend, EcoHealth Alliance Incorporated President Dr. Peter Daszak. Dr. Fauci maintained his misleading claim that the NIH never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China. In 2021, he told Senator Rand Paul that the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, repeating his earlier testimony. That was a lie. Then, amazingly, Fauci doubled down on his previous claim by stating the NIH did not fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He stated this publicly. Notably, former acting NIH Director Dr. Lawrence Tabak told the Select Subcommittee recently that the NIH did in fact fund gain-of-function research in Wuhan, contradicting Fauci. Following the many fiery exchanges between Fauci and members of the various committees where he lied under oath and the emails and documents proving it, NIH quietly removed the Wuhan lab from its list of approved animal labs. Documents were discovered showing the Wuhan lab conspired with the NIH and EHA to violate a federal ban on gain-of-function experiments that was put in place by the Obama-Biden administration in 2014. Now, as all of this was unfolding for 3 years, Fauci unleashed attacks against anyone in the professional community who challenged his assertions and decisions. He used his influence to shut down dissenting voices, using his progressive allies in the social and mainstream media and government to do so. But facts are very disturbing things. Documents published in late 2021 by The Intercept revealed that the EcoHealth Alliance used grants from Fauci's agency to fund Wuhan Institute of Virology experiments that modified 3 bat coronaviruses distinct from COVID-19. Senator Tom Cotton, Republican of Arkansas, stated in an address, last week this agency admitted that they had in fact funded gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. History should judge him as a deficient person who made one of the worst decisions in public health history in the entire history of the world, Rand Paul said of the former chief White House medical advisor during an interview on WABC 770 AM's The Cats Roundtable. Paul continued, for his dishonesty, frankly, he should go to prison, he told host John Katzimatidis. Do you think the scientific knowledge that was gained from this research is worth the deaths of 20 million people? The New York Post reported back in January of 2024 that Rand Paul said Dr. Fauci should go to prison for mishandling the COVID-19 pandemic and making the worst decision ever made by a public health official in the history of time. Rand Paul cited the Government Accountability Office report in June 2023 that found the National Institutes of Health had contributed more than $1.4 million to Chinese research institutions between 2014 and 2019, despite serious biosafety concerns, including at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Dr. Fauci then corrected his previous testimony that his staff did not possess conflicts of interest. During his transcribed interview, he claimed, the only people that I'm involved with is my own staff, who we've mentioned many times in this discussion, who don't have a conflict of interest. During his testimony, he changed his position, testifying that Dr. Morans definitely had a conflict of interest. Dr. Fauci then publicly changed his mind that the lab leak hypothesis was possible and not a conspiracy theory in his statement to Representative Jim Jordan, Republican of Ohio, and he falsely claimed that he has kept an open mind about the origins of the pandemic. This again contradicts the publication of the now infamous Proximal Origin paper that attempted to vilify and disprove the lab leak hypothesis to protect Fauci and his illegal activities. But there was yet another scandal involving Fauci that surfaced in October 2021 when Republican U.S. House Representative Nancy Mace of South Carolina tweeted a letter she sent to Fauci referencing documents obtained via a Freedom of Information Act request from WCW. WCW claimed that from October 2018 to February 2019, Fauci ordered cruel and unusual drug toxicity tests on dogs that cost taxpayers $1.68 million. In a third report, WCW claimed that NIAID funded more than $375,000 to $424,000 to conduct a study that again used beagles as test subjects in experiments involving sandflies that the organization described as torture. The documents outlined both the proposed study design as well as the actual results of the study, the latter of which resulted in 40 beagles between the ages of 8 and 9 months being administered oral and subcutaneous doses of an unnamed HIV therapeutic between September 2018 and October 2019. All dogs were euthanized following the study and their organs were analyzed for potential toxicity from the drugs. The horrendous beagle experiments totaled more than $1.8 million paid by taxpayers and had no congressional knowledge or oversight. Fauci was also the highest paid government official in history and made millions from kickbacks from the drug companies. He escaped and evaded criminal charges under Biden and retired with the taxpayers footing the $15 million per year bill for his personal security and protection team. Now that we have a new administration, let's see that stripped away and see that Dr. Fauci gets a few weeks in court. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.